For decades, country music fans believed these names were long gone, fading quietly into history. Their songs stopped playing on the radio, their faces disappeared from television, and the world simply moved on. But here's the truth no one talks about. As of January 2026, these forgotten country stars are still alive. No headlines, no comebacks, just survivors of a golden era that left them behind while their legends slowly vanished. Bobby Bare. At one point, Bobby Bare's voice was impossible to escape. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, his songs drifted through American living rooms, jukeboxes, and long highway drives, carrying stories that felt ordinary yet deeply human. He wasn't just another country singer chasing chart positions. Bare represented something quieter and more unsettling. A man who sounded like he had actually lived the lives he was singing about. Born in Ohio and raised in hardship, Bare arrived in Nashville as an outsider. He didn't fit the polished image the industry preferred, and that became his strength. Songs like Detroit City and 500 Miles Away from Home turned him into a star almost by accident. His voice carried exhaustion, regret, and distance. Audiences connected because he sounded like someone who understood loss, not someone performing it. By the early 70s, Bobby Bare was a regular presence on country radio and television, widely respected even if he was never marketed as a glamorous headliner. But fame never sat comfortably with him. While others chased trends and crossover appeal, Bare moved in the opposite direction. His collaborations with songwriter Shel Silverstein were risky, dark, and often uncomfortable. These songs questioned marriage, masculinity, money, and the cost of chasing success. Nashville tolerated him, but it never fully embraced him. Slowly, his radio presence faded. New stars arrived with louder personalities and cleaner images. Bobby Bare didn't fall in a scandal. He simply stepped out of the spotlight while the spotlight moved on without him. As the decades passed, his name slipped into a strange category. Not legendary enough to be constantly celebrated, not controversial enough to be remembered through scandal. For many fans who grew up hearing his voice, time filled in the blanks incorrectly. Bobby Bare became one of those artists people assumed had passed away quietly years ago. No headlines ever corrected that assumption. The truth is far less dramatic and far sadder. As of January 2026, Bobby Bare is still alive. He lives quietly, rarely appearing in mainstream media, occasionally acknowledged by hardcore country historians, but largely invisible to the public he once reached so easily. His survival isn't marked by revival tours or tribute specials. It's marked by silence. Bobby Bare didn't die young. He didn't burn out. He simply outlived the era that understood him. In a genre obsessed with honoring legends, his story is a reminder that sometimes the most authentic voices don't disappear because they failed. They disappear because the world stopped listening. Jeannie Seely. For many country fans, Jeannie Seely exists as a frozen image in time. A familiar face from black and white television screens, classic Grand Ole Opry broadcasts, and a handful of songs that once played endlessly on country radio. To younger audiences, she feels like someone who belonged to a distant era, the kind of artist whose story already reached its final chapter decades ago. And that assumption has quietly erased her from modern memory. Jeannie Seely rose to prominence in the late 1960s, a time when female country singers were often expected to fit narrow roles. She didn't. Her breakout hit Don't Touch Me wasn't just successful, it was defiant. The song gave her a Grammy and turned her into a symbol of emotional honesty at a time when women's voices in country music were still tightly controlled. On stage, Seely projected confidence and individuality, refusing to soften herself to fit industry expectations. She dressed differently, spoke differently, and sounded different. For a moment, she stood out clearly. Throughout the 70s, her presence remained steady, but understated. She became a familiar figure at the Grand Ole Opry, appearing week after week, year after year. While others chased chart dominance, Jeannie Seely became something else entirely. A constant. Reliable, respected, and quietly influential. Yet that consistency came at a cost. Without dramatic career highs or public scandals, her story lacked the kind of narrative that keeps names circulating in popular culture. As country music evolved, her image became increasingly tied to nostalgia. Television reruns and old recordings preserved her younger self, while her current existence slowly disappeared from view. To many fans, Jeannie Seely stopped aging altogether. She became part of country music's past tense. Online discussions often referenced her as if she were no longer alive, not out of malice, but out of habit. Time had placed her neatly in a mental archive labeled gone. But as of January 2026, Jeannie Seely is still alive, still present, still part of the world she helped shape. Yet her survival doesn't look like triumph. It looks like quiet endurance, occasional appearances, sparse headlines, minimal recognition from an industry that rarely looks backward unless there's a marketable anniversary attached. Her story exposes a different kind of disappearance, not the sudden collapse of fame, but the slow fading of visibility. Jeannie Seely didn't fall. She wasn't erased by scandal or failure. She was simply left behind as country music raced forward, rewriting its own history and forgetting those who once stood at its center. In a genre that prides itself on honoring tradition, her continued life feels almost inconvenient. A living reminder that some legends don't die, they just become invisible. Johnny Lee. For a brief moment, Johnny Lee stood exactly where every country artist dreams of standing. His voice was everywhere. His image inseparable from one of the most influential country pop moments of the late 1970s. When urban cowboy exploded into mainstream culture, Johnny Lee's name became synonymous with that era. He wasn't just riding the wave, he was the sound of it. Lookin' for Love turned Johnny Lee into a household name almost overnight. The song crossed genre lines, pulling country music into dance halls, movie theaters, and suburban living rooms far beyond Nashville's traditional audience. For many listeners, he wasn't just a singer. He was the gateway into country music itself. At his peak, Johnny Lee had chart success, industry momentum, and public visibility that suggested a long, secure career ahead. Then, almost as quickly as he arrived, he vanished. The success that lifted him also boxed him in. Johnny Lee became permanently tied to a single cultural moment, and when that moment passed, Nashville moved on. New sounds replaced the urban cowboy aesthetic. Record labels chased fresher faces. Radio playlists shifted. Johnny Lee didn't implode through scandal or self-destruction. He simply stopped being useful to an industry that thrives on constant reinvention. By the mid-1980s, his presence had faded dramatically. Albums came and went with little attention. Television appearances slowed. Interviews disappeared. Without controversy or tragedy to keep his name alive, public memory quietly filled in the gap with an assumption. Johnny Lee must be gone, or at least gone in the only way fame recognizes. Decades later, that assumption hardened into belief. Online discussions often reference him in the past tense. Younger fans encounter his music through old film soundtracks and assume his story ended with the credits. He became another voice trapped in a specific era, preserved only through nostalgia playlists and reruns. But as of January 2026, Johnny Lee is still alive. His life today exists far from the spotlight that once defined him. No major comeback tours, no viral rediscovery, just a man who outlived the role history assigned him. His survival is rarely acknowledged because it doesn't fit the narrative people prefer. We like our stars frozen in time, either eternally young or tragically lost. Johnny Lee is neither. His story is unsettling because it's ordinary. He didn't crash, he didn't burn out, he was simply replaced. In a genre built on storytelling, his silence tells a story country music rarely wants to hear. Fame doesn't always end in disaster. Sometimes it ends in being quietly forgotten while you're still very much alive. Sylvia. In the early 1980s, Sylvia's voice felt unavoidable. Smooth, emotional, and unmistakably tied to the softer edge of country pop, she arrived at a moment when Nashville was opening its doors to crossover appeal. Her songs didn't shout, they lingered. And for a brief period, that was exactly what audiences wanted. Sylvia's breakthrough came with Nobody, a song that climbed charts and placed her squarely in the public eye. She wasn't marketed as a rebel or a traditionalist. She existed somewhere in between. Relatable, accessible, and emotionally restrained. Her image fit television perfectly. Her voice fit radio effortlessly. By all visible measures, her career was only beginning. But success came with quiet pressure. Behind the scenes, Sylvia struggled with the direction the industry expected her to follow. As country music leaned further into polished pop sounds, she felt increasingly disconnected from the persona being shaped around her. The more successful she became, the less control she felt she had over her own voice, both literally and creatively. Then came the disappearance. Unlike many artists whose decline is marked by scandal, addiction, or public breakdown, Sylvia simply stepped away. No dramatic farewell, no headlines explaining her absence. One moment she was charting hits, the next, she was gone. Albums stopped arriving. Television appearances ended. Nashville moved forward without explanation, and the silence left room for assumption. Over time, that silence rewrote her story. Fans searching for updates found very little. New generations encountered her songs without context, assuming she belonged to a past that had already closed its final chapter. Online forums occasionally referenced her as if she were no longer alive. Not out of disrespect, but because disappearance often feels indistinguishable from death in the public imagination. As of January 2026, Sylvia is still alive. Her life today exists almost entirely outside the machinery of the music industry. She chose privacy over relevance, withdrawal over reinvention. In a world that rewards constant visibility, her absence feels unsettling. There was no comeback tour to reintroduce her, no biopic to restore her narrative, just distance. Sylvia's story highlights a rarely acknowledged truth in country music. Some artists don't fall because they fail. They vanish because they refuse to keep playing a role that no longer feels honest. Her survival challenges the assumption that success must be followed by constant presence. She didn't disappear because she was forgotten. She disappeared because she walked away, and the world simply forgot to notice. Lacy J. Dalton. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Lacy J. Dalton didn't sound like anyone else on country radio. Her voice was rough, weathered, and unapologetically raw, carrying an edge that cut through the polished production dominating Nashville at the time. She didn't sing like a star manufactured for crossover success. She sang like someone who had lived the stories she was telling, and that authenticity made her impossible to ignore. Dalton broke through with songs like Crazy Blue Eyes and 16th Avenue, tracks that resonated deeply with listeners who felt alienated by the industry's growing gloss. 16th Avenue in particular became an unintentional anthem for artists crushed by Nashville's machinery. It wasn't celebratory, it was bitter, honest, and quietly accusatory. For a moment, Lacy J. Dalton stood as the voice of those who didn't quite belong, even as they chased success. But that honesty came at a cost. Dalton never fit the industry's preferred image of female country stars. She wasn't easily packaged. She didn't soften her voice or her message to please radio programmers. While her peers leaned into smoother sounds and broader appeal, Dalton remained stubbornly herself. Nashville tolerated her talent, but it never fully embraced her longevity. As trends shifted, her airplay declined. New voices arrived with cleaner edges and more adaptable personas. Dalton's albums stopped generating attention, not because of a creative collapse, but because the industry no longer knew what to do with someone who refused to evolve on its terms. Gradually, her name slipped out of circulation. No scandal marked her exit. No dramatic downfall followed. She simply stopped being invited into the conversation. Over time, that absence transformed into assumption. Fans who once recognized her instantly began speaking about her in the past tense. Her songs lived on through classic country playlists, but her name became detached from the present. Many listeners quietly concluded that Lacy J. Dalton must have died years ago. There were no headlines to say otherwise. As of January 2026, Lacy J. Dalton is still alive. Her life today exists far from the center of country music's attention. She lives quietly, rarely appearing in mainstream media. Her legacy carried more by memory than by recognition. The industry that once benefited from her authenticity moved on without preserving her place in its narrative. Dalton's story reveals one of country music's most uncomfortable truths. Sometimes the artists who speak most honestly are the easiest to discard. She didn't disappear because she failed. She disappeared because she refused to become something else. And in a genre that claims to value truth, that refusal was enough to erase her from public consciousness while she was still very much alive. During the late 1980s, T. Graham Brown's voice was instantly recognizable. Smooth yet aching, polished but emotionally heavy, it dominated country radio at a time when the genre balanced traditional roots with pop accessibility. Songs like Hell and High Water and I Tell It Like It Used to Be weren't just hits. They became emotional markers for a generation of listeners who associated his voice with heartbreak, reflection, and late-night radio confessions. Brown's rise was steady and convincing. He wasn't marketed as a flashy star or a rebellious outsider. He fit perfectly into Nashville's machinery. Chart success, television appearances, and industry approval followed. On the surface, his career looked secure, even comfortable. Few artists seemed better positioned to age gracefully within the country establishment. But behind that smooth exterior, something darker was growing. As his success increased, so did his dependence on alcohol. What began as coping quietly escalated into a struggle that reshaped his life and career. Unlike artists whose addictions exploded publicly, Brown's battle unfolded mostly out of sight. There were no infamous arrests or tabloid scandals to freeze his image in public memory. Instead, there was a slow erosion, missed opportunities, diminishing visibility, a gradual distancing from the industry that once welcomed him. By the early 1990s, his presence on the charts had faded. New voices dominated radio. Brown's name stopped appearing in headlines, and without a dramatic collapse to explain his absence, the public filled in the blanks. For many fans, his disappearance felt final. The assumption settled quietly. Another country singer lost to excess. Another familiar voice silenced permanently. That assumption lingered for decades. As time passed, younger audiences encountered his music through old playlists and compilation albums, rarely questioning what became of the man behind the voice. Online discussions often referenced him as if his story had already ended. Silence had done its work. Memory blurred into myth. The reality is different. As of January 2026, T. Graham Brown is still alive. In later years, he confronted his addiction openly, stepping away from the destructive patterns that once controlled him. But recovery did not bring renewed fame. The industry had already moved on. There were no major comeback campaigns waiting on the other side of sobriety. His survival wasn't framed as a triumphant redemption story. It was quiet, private, largely ignored. Brown's story unsettles because it resists neat conclusions. He didn't die at his lowest point. He didn't reclaim his former glory. He simply lived on, carrying the weight of what could have been. In country music, where tragedy often cements legacy, surviving can sometimes feel like the loneliest outcome of all. Johnny Duncan. For a time, Johnny Duncan's voice was woven into the everyday soundtrack of classic country radio. His smooth honky tonk delivery and easy phrasing fit perfectly into the late 1960s and 1970s, an era when country music still sounded grounded, familiar, and deeply American. He wasn't a headline-chasing superstar, but he was everywhere. And that quiet ubiquity made his later disappearance all the more complete. Johnny Duncan built his career the old-fashioned way. Years of touring, steady radio play, and a string of respectable hits earned him a loyal audience. Songs like Stranger and I Love You More Today didn't rely on gimmicks or spectacle. They relied on emotional restraint and storytelling, the kind that made listeners feel like they were hearing a friend confess something personal. Duncan's strength was reliability. He showed up, delivered, and moved on to the next song. But reliability is rarely rewarded in an industry that thrives on reinvention. As country music shifted in the late 1970s, the genre began favoring bigger personalities and louder narratives. Johnny Duncan didn't adapt to trends. He didn't chase crossover success or reshape his image. He remained who he had always been, and slowly that became a liability. Radio programmers looked elsewhere. Labels invested in newer faces. Duncan's name faded from playlists without ceremony. There was no dramatic end to his career. No scandal. No final tour announced with fanfare. He simply slipped out of public view. And because his disappearance lacked a defining moment, memory replaced fact. For many listeners, Johnny Duncan became another artist presumed gone, quietly folded into the long list of country singers who seemed to vanish with time. Decades passed. His songs continued to exist on old vinyl collections and classic country stations, detached from any sense of a living presence behind them. Younger fans encountered his voice without ever seeing his name mentioned in modern conversation. Silence did the rest. As of January 2026, Johnny Duncan is still alive. His life today stands in stark contrast to the era that once welcomed his music so warmly. He lives far from the spotlight, largely unacknowledged by the industry he helped sustain. There are no major retrospectives, no rediscovery campaigns, no renewed appreciation from mainstream media. Just the quiet continuation of a life that outlasted its relevance. Johnny Duncan's story reveals how easily consistency can be mistaken for insignificance. He didn't fail. He didn't self-destruct. He simply stayed the same while the world changed around him. And in country music, that can be enough to erase a name from memory, while the person behind it is still very much alive. Ed Bruce spent most of his career standing slightly out of focus, even when his work was everywhere. His voice, his words, and his influence shaped country music for decades, yet his name rarely sat at the center of the spotlight. To many listeners, he feels like a figure from an earlier chapter of the genre, someone whose story must have ended long ago. And that quiet misunderstanding has allowed him to fade almost completely from public awareness. Bruce's journey into country music began unusually early. As a teenager, he was already writing songs that caught the attention of major industry figures. He understood storytelling instinctively, crafting lyrics that felt conversational, lived in, and emotionally restrained. While he did record as a singer, his true power often operated behind the scenes. As a songwriter, Ed Bruce helped shape the careers of artists far more visible than himself, contributing material that would outlive his own public recognition. In the 1970s and early 1980s, Bruce did enjoy his own moment in front of the microphone. Songs like Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys, co-written with his wife Patsy Bruce, became defining statements of the era. The song didn't just succeed commercially. It became cultural shorthand for a certain rugged, fading version of the American West. Yet even at that peak, Bruce remained oddly understated. He was respected, not idolized, present, but rarely celebrated. That pattern followed him throughout his career. He transitioned smoothly between roles, appearing as a performer, a writer, and even an actor, but never fully claiming one identity that the public could latch onto. As Nashville evolved and the genre shifted toward younger stars and sharper images, Bruce's multifaceted career worked against him. He was difficult to categorize, and in an industry that prefers simple narratives, complexity often leads to neglect. As the years passed, his presence diminished without explanation. New generations encountered his most famous song without knowing the man behind it. His name slowly detached from his work. Without controversy, scandal, or tragedy to preserve his image, Ed Bruce became one of those figures people quietly assumed had passed away. The absence of news felt like confirmation. As of January 2026, Ed Bruce is still alive. His survival, however, exists far from the noise of recognition. He lives quietly, largely removed from mainstream attention, acknowledged occasionally by devoted country historians, but forgotten by the broader audience he once reached indirectly through his words. There are no grand tributes announcing his continued existence, just silence. Ed Bruce's story exposes a harsh reality of country music history. Sometimes the architects of the genre don't disappear because they failed. They disappear because their work became so embedded in the culture that their own names were no longer remembered. He outlived his fame, his era, and the industry's interest, becoming another living ghost of country music's past. Moe Bandy. For decades, Moe Bandy's voice represented a version of country music that refused to bend. While trends shifted toward pop gloss and crossover appeal, Bandy remained anchored in honky tonk tradition. His songs were unapologetically old school, built around heartbreak, barrooms, and emotional resignation. For listeners who valued authenticity over innovation, he felt timeless. But for an industry obsessed with reinvention, that stubborn consistency slowly pushed him into obscurity. Moe Bandy rose to prominence in the late 1970s, delivering a string of hits that spoke directly to country's core audience. Songs like Bandy the Rodeo Clown and I Cheated Me Right Out of You weren't chasing mainstream approval. They were speaking to people who recognized themselves in failure, regret, and quiet survival. Bandy didn't soften his image or his voice. He embraced the role of the traditionalist, even as Nashville began drifting away from its roots. For a while, that resistance worked. He became a reliable chart presence and a respected figure among fans who felt alienated by the genre's changing sound. His duets with Joe Stampley further cemented his place as a honky tonk standard bearer. But while respect endured, momentum did not. Radio began favoring artists who sounded younger, smoother, and more adaptable. Moe Bandy's refusal to evolve became his defining trait, and eventually, his undoing. As the 1980s progressed, his airplay dwindled. Record labels shifted their investments elsewhere. Without controversy or self-destruction to explain his decline, Bandy's absence went largely unnoticed. He didn't disappear overnight. He faded gradually, slipping from mainstream consciousness while still actively recording and performing for a shrinking audience. Over time, that fading turned into assumption. For casual fans, Moe Bandy became another name associated with classic country radio, a voice belonging to an era presumed closed. Younger listeners encountering his music often assumed he had died years ago, simply because no one spoke about him in the present tense. Silence became its own narrative. As of January 2026, Moe Bandy is still alive. He continues to exist outside the spotlight, occasionally performing and maintaining a connection with the fans who never stopped listening. But mainstream recognition has long since moved on. There are no viral rediscoveries or industry-led reassessments of his legacy. His survival remains largely unacknowledged, overshadowed by the myth that traditional country itself has become obsolete. Moe Bandy's story challenges a comforting illusion within country music. Staying true doesn't always protect an artist's place in history. Sometimes it accelerates their disappearance. He didn't lose his career through scandal or failure. He lost it by refusing to abandon a sound the industry decided it no longer needed. And in doing so, he became another living reminder of a past the genre is hesitant to remember. Gene Watson. Among hardcore country fans, Gene Watson's voice is spoken about with reverence. Clear, controlled, and emotionally precise, it has long been considered one of the purest vocal instruments the genre ever produced. Yet outside that devoted circle, his name has slowly slipped into obscurity. For the wider public, Gene Watson often feels like a figure from a closed chapter of country history, someone whose story must have ended years ago. Watson emerged in the 1970s with a style that leaned heavily into traditional country values. He wasn't chasing crossover success or reinventing the genre. His songs focused on heartbreak, regret, and quiet endurance, delivered without excess drama. Hits like Love in the Hot Afternoon and 14 Karat Mind showcased a singer who valued clarity over theatrics. At his peak, Watson was a consistent presence on the charts, respected for his vocal discipline, even if he was never aggressively marketed as a superstar. But respect does not guarantee longevity. As country music shifted through the 1980s and beyond, Watson found himself increasingly out of sync with the industry's priorities. Radio leaned toward younger artists with broader appeal. Labels invested in personalities as much as voices. Gene Watson remained committed to traditional country, refusing to dilute his sound or reshape his image. While that choice preserved his artistic integrity, it slowly pushed him to the margins of mainstream attention. Unlike many forgotten artists, Watson never truly disappeared. He continued recording, he continued touring, he continued singing with the same precision that once defined his career. But because these efforts existed largely outside mainstream media, public perception failed to update. To casual listeners, his absence from headlines felt permanent. Over time, assumption replaced reality. Many fans quietly believed Gene Watson had passed away, simply because no one told them otherwise. As of January 2026, Gene Watson is still alive. His continued existence, however, highlights one of country music's most uncomfortable truths. Survival alone does not preserve legacy. Without constant exposure, even excellence fades from collective memory. Watson's voice, once a benchmark of traditional country singing, now exists primarily in archives, playlists, and the memories of those who never stopped paying attention. Gene Watson didn't fall from grace. He wasn't destroyed by scandal, addiction, or controversy. He did everything right by the standards of traditional country music, and yet he still became invisible to the broader audience. His story is a quiet indictment of an industry that claims to honor its roots while allowing some of its most authentic voices to be forgotten, even as they continue to live, sing, and endure beyond the era that once celebrated them.